Well, thank you very much, Abebe, and thank you all for being here. It's a real honor to get to come speak at AEC. As a longtime student of African agriculture myself, I've learned from many people in the room, and I've found this to be a fascinating topic, so it's very exciting to me to see this whole conference. I was asked to give a few remarks on building a resilient and sustainable agriculture in Africa. I will come back to these gentlemen in the Chalbi Desert of Kenya, who I had a wonderful week with, in just a moment. So the first point that I want to make is an observation I made with in studying with a brilliant young production economist at what was then called the West Africa Rice Development Association, a fellow who you now know as the president of the ADB. Akin Adesina, when he was working with WARDA, we did quite a bit of work together in Cote d'Ivoire among rice farmers. And one of the most fundamental findings that came from the portfolio of papers we wrote together was that the old Ted Schultz claim that farmers are poor but efficient holds among African farmers. And this is why that's important. These folks get about 2 liters of milk a day from each of the adult lactating camels. That's not very much in terms of milk production. But no dairy farmer in America or Europe could do as well in that environment. It's important to think about the environment in which a producer operates. So 2 liters a day from camels in a desert is actually performing on the production possibility frontier. And the essence of that graphic on the left that comes from a paper with Adesina and one of my former graduate students is that when we fail to control for the environmental production conditions under which an African farmer labors, the rainfall, the soils, the pest pressure, the slope of the land, etc., then it looks like on average farmers are at only about half of their production potential, that they're leaving half of the potential productivity on the table, if you will. But once we take into consideration those environmental factors that are beyond the control of the farmer, the median African small farmer is on the production possibility frontier. They are operating at optimal output. And that's a really fundamental point to appreciate because, one, it means that when we observe low productivity, this is commonly not because the farmers are inefficient in the sense of they could manage their inputs more effectively to generate more output. Rather, it means that the technologies and the markets at their disposal are limiting their output. That's a subtle but really important distinction because the implication is that what is really needed is innovation. We have to innovate with technologies and markets that release the productive potential of farmers who already operate on their production frontier. So what do we know about inputs that supposedly help with this? Inputs that add to the productivity of a small farmer? Well, first we know that modern agricultural inputs are disseminating quite rapidly in sub-Saharan Africa. If we were to look at the data from 15 years ago, we'd find very low rates of use of inorganic fertilizers, modern varieties of crop seed, agrochemicals, etc. Today, you find quite a lot of farmers using, including small farmers, using modern agricultural inputs, but it's highly heterogeneous, as depicted in these 2 graphics that show you maps based off of the nationally representative survey data coming through the LSMS ISA panel surveys run by national statistical agencies across the continent in collaboration with the World Bank. The graphic on the left shows us the proportion of farmers using inorganic fertilizers. Dark means many, light means few. And the graphic on the right tells us the same proportions for pesticides, for herbicides, insecticides, the complex of chemical pesticides. So 2 things that should strike you there. One is that the old claim that African farmers don't use modern inputs is demonstrably not true. Quite a few of them are using modern inputs. In places like Malawi and Ethiopia, more than half of farmers are today using purchased inorganic fertilizers. But the second thing you should take away from that graphic is it's highly uneven. The modern technologies are not disseminating to everybody by any stretch of the imagination. So why is that true? Well, the first thing to explain patterns of uneven uptake, especially for well-established technologies like inorganic fertilizer or hybrid maize seed, is that the returns are uneven across space. That different zones, even within the same country, have quite different drainage profiles, different soils, different weather patterns, and therefore a technology that's good in one place isn't necessarily more profitable 100 kilometers away. So the agroecological specificity of technologies is what drives their productivity and their resilience in the face of climate change and other risks. So we have rapidly growing evidence of this. On the left, you see a graphic that shows you results of fertilizer profitability estimates in Ethiopia. There's actually a really fascinating online tool. You can play with different combinations of prices and locations and value-cost ratio and your tolerance for risk on an online platform at Cornell to see what the geography of fertilizer profitability looks like. On the right, you see estimates of profitability by different areas of Malawi, and there are a variety of studies that show very similar things. But the point of this is that the new technologies that are on offer are productive and profitable only for some, and they're differentially profitable. Not all farmers actually benefit from all the modern technologies, hence the uneven uptake. So why? Well, one of the most compelling reasons is that nature affects profitability. And in some places, nature is treating farmers poorly and we have not intervened to help. Soils and water are the primary cases. Water availability for African farmers is highly limited. Less than 10% of African farmers are able to irrigate. By contrast, in North America, where I live, more than 60% of farmers have irrigation. So there's a huge difference in the ability to manage water effectively, which has enormous implications for managing drought in particular, but also just for managing optimally for crop growth. The two graphics here depict the implications of soil quality, in particular soil organic matter. As soils degrade, the productivity of inorganic fertilizer also degrades. So we often think about fertilizer purchased from agro-input dealers as a substitute for the natural fertility of soils, but the soil chemists and biologists have taught us over the last 10 to 20 years that they're really much more complements than substitutes. And soil organic matter, as a good proxy for the overall health of soil, tells us that on the left, the marginal returns to fertilizer, which is plotted with a non-parametric regression and confidence bands around it, the marginal returns to fertilizer use in maize production in Western Kenya is flat and very low when soil organic matter is very low. Put simply, if you put fertilizer on sand, you're not going to grow much. So you need something a little more substantive. And what's striking in that graphic is there's a rapid inflection point that starts to hit around 2.5% to 3% of soil organic matter, and then it tapers off a bit after that. And as you can see with the red dashed horizontal line that plots the fertilizer price at the time we were doing these estimates, about half of the soil domain listed there, the soil organic matter domain, finds fertilizer use to be unprofitable. Why that matters is depicted on the right, which shows the household incomes over the same farms plotted against the same scale. And what you notice is that the poorest households, the one on the leftmost reach of the right-hand graphic, that their incomes are below the rural poverty line for Kenya, which is the red line on the right. So the poorest farmers are the ones cultivating soils that are most degraded in soil organic matter, for whom the marginal profitability of fertilizer is negative. It's optimal for poor farmers to not apply fertilizer in that setting on degraded soil. That's very important to keep in mind as we keep lecturing small farmers, you must use fertilizer, you must use fertilizer. Sometimes we need to invest in soil conservation or even soil rehabilitation as well as water management. Prices and markets are obviously central. Costs of reaching market for small farmers, especially in more remote areas, are prohibitively high. That's one of the reasons why fertilizer is more expensive in sub-Saharan Africa than it is in North America and Europe and China, because the transport costs that drive a wedge between the landed price of fertilizer manufactured abroad and imported, and then the cost of the ground transport to deliver to a small farmer in a landlocked region of a landlocked country, those transport costs make fertilizer incredibly expensive. And they also make the market price responsiveness relatively low compared to oil prices, because transport winds up being so much of the issue in the marketing margins for African agriculture. So helping to make markets work more efficiently for the poor through efficient transport sectors is actually very important to a sustainable, resilient, productive agriculture in Africa. So there are two broad implications here that I want to leave you with as we think about this topic of sustainable and resilient agriculture. The first is context matters. We in the United States are more guilty than anybody else about talking of Africa as if it's one place. There are an enormous number of different agroecologies, different market conditions throughout the continent, and it's really important to be nuanced and particular about the places to which we're referring. Businesses are especially good at tailoring their products and their marketing strategies and their supply chains to very specific niches. That's one reason why we need to rely more heavily on the private sector in trying to stimulate agricultural productivity growth in Africa. The best technologies are not one size fits all. They vary according to context. The right seed, the right fertilizer blend, the right way of managing water. And the physical and institutional infrastructure drive an awful lot of incentives. Innovations like the Ethiopia Commodity Exchange, that's a picture I took sitting in a very small town in southern Ethiopia where there's a near real-time posting on the electronic board of current commodity prices. And farmers congregate to watch this, and they make management and sales decisions on the basis of that. That changes the game for small farmers. They have good information. They can make better informed decisions. Adaptation to ecological niches is really important and requires investment, both from the national agricultural research systems, but also from the private sector. The second big implication is that bundled approaches are often needed. By that, I mean the following. It is rare that there's a single limiting factor. If there was a single limiting factor to improving the productivity of rice farmers in Nigeria, I can assure you Minister Adesina would have taken care of that constraint in the stroke of a pen, and a year later we would have seen doubling, tripling of rice productivity. African cereals productivity has been increasing quickly in recent years. It's been increasing in per capita real terms, but it still is only half the yields of South Asia and a quarter the yields of China. We face multiple constraints, soil constraints, water constraints, marketing constraints, that limit the productivity and resilience right now of African farmers, especially small farmers. So we commonly need to intervene with multiple coordinated interventions. The good news is we find that that's working. The best available evidence in development economics today concerns bundled approaches to poverty reduction, the so-called ultra-poor programs, pioneered by, among others, BRAC, the Bangladesh NGO. And a series of studies have found very powerful and lasting impacts of coordinated bundled interventions. Groups like One Acre Fund, working in multiple countries in Africa right now, are following that same strategy, and their early evidence is it's working. Bundled approaches work. Next, we need natural resources conservation. I've already talked about the challenge of soils and water. We economists often look the contribution nature makes to productivity. It's absolutely essential to return to the basic foundational roots of agriculture, which are in the root zone after all. It's a dirty subject, pun intended, but soils are rather important to agriculture. We haven't paid enough time and attention to reconstituting them. One good news is businesses really will invest in this. So we've seen evidence of businesses investing in bundled approaches with soil conservation, water delivery, product evacuation, even road improvement in a number of places, in Madagascar, in Kenya, et cetera. It's time for us to spend more attention on these things. So with that, I look forward to hearing my colleagues' comments and to the discussion over the next couple of days. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. This is entirely in your area, so please.
Thank you very much, Abebe. And thanks to Chris, you've nicely set up a basis for our discussion this afternoon. Let me start off where Chris left things off. Chris started by saying that poor farmers are efficient, and the main problem is with the resources they work with, as well as technologies available to them and the access to market. When we talk about building a resilient and sustainable agriculture in Africa, building sustainable agriculture starts with sustainable natural resources. And as you rightly pointed out, Africa is so diverse. When you look across Africa, you see heterogeneous conditions. But I would like to focus principally on water. Water is largely abundant in Africa. If you look at the map of Africa, if you leave out the northern fringes of North Africa and the southern tip in Southern Africa, the vast middle belt is what we call an area suffering from economic water scarcity. Economic water scarcity in the sense that what is actually needed is investment in infrastructure and finance to be able to tap into available water, to be able to make agriculture much more productive in Africa. There's no shortage of knowledge or technologies or tools to be able to improve irrigation in Africa. Right now, for the continent as a whole, the proportion of irrigated area to total cultivated area is about 5.2%. That is scandalous. There's no reason why Africa cannot increase the area under irrigation. And looking at the way we can make use of our water, as I said, there's no shortage of knowledge or technologies to use. We know we have technology to make water available. There is technology to tap into the underutilized groundwater resources across Africa. We have technologies for efficient irrigation that would allow more food to be produced per unit of water, and that will also allow us to have an increase in the area under irrigation. But also we have the technologies for the energy needed to lift the water and to distribute the water. Now, for most of the rural farmers who live in out-of-grid connection areas, of course they have a limitation. As the president of the African Development Bank said this morning, about 645 million Africans are without access to energy. But then we have solar energy. And actually, it's renewable and it's largely available to the African continent. So that is an area, if we want to actually improve access to water, we need to look at how we can tap solar energy. But also we have technologies to allow us to better capture flood water, to be able to make use of that water in providing resources needed by farmers during drought period or even during the dry spell they experience during the main rainy season. In essence then, what we need is to better understand the interdependency between climate change, between water, between agriculture, energy, transport, and the environment. The irony about water is we need water to be able to make agriculture climate resilient as well as to adapt to the drought. But at the same time, because of ongoing trends in population, in urbanization, as well as in demand for food, the demand for water will also increase. Therefore, we need to, as we use water for agriculture, we also need to encourage resource use efficiency, not only in water, but in also the way we manage the land on which agriculture depends. So when one looks at the interdependence between the natural resources as well as other sectors outside agriculture, I believe that is where the key lies in actually building a resilient and sustainable agriculture in Africa. Without that, then we tend to address problems in silos, and that will not get us to where we want to go. Chris talked about making markets work for the poor. That is really very important. If you expand the use of irrigation, you improve access of farmers to the other resources, soil amendments, water resources they need, they will increase production. There is no doubt about that. But then you don't want a situation where you create a glut. And that makes it important to be able to provide access to markets so that when they produce and they increase production, then they will be able to have the access to the right resources to be able to do this. And this reminds me, about 10 years ago now, Chris organized a meeting in Michigan where we talked for about 2 weeks on making markets work for the poor. And I believe that theme is still relevant today, in that in Africa, building a resilient and sustainable agriculture also implies that we make it possible for farmers to be able to access markets. What then do we need? I believe we need a situation whereby we can allow or provide the enabling environment for farmers to have increased access to water as an input, but also at the same time to be able to make sure that we encourage water use efficiency. So we don't want to go through the Asian experience where you use flood irrigation to be able to raise productivity. There are improved technologies that can allow us to have precision irrigation, and we also have the technology that will allow us to look at energy sources, renewable green energy sources, to bring about the change that is required. And I believe with these necessary conditions put in place, our farmers will rise to the challenge and be able to actually demonstrate their capability and their resourcefulness in bringing about a change in agriculture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Timothy. This is very precise and quite very informative. So,
thanks. Well, I think very, very interesting. I think you put key elements in the discussion of the sustainability of agriculture. What I would like to bring into the discussion is the other aspect of it. That is, what is missing to add value to agriculture and commodities. We clearly understand, I'm working for UNIDA, so the theme of this very interesting conference, in fact, is adding value to industrialized. So we have a lot of resources, we have problems, we have issues, but one of the key elements we try to address are the post-harvest losses. Because production, as an average in Africa, if you produce 100, reach a market only about 60%. So that meaning that along the way from yield, from production to consumption, 40% is lost. So it doesn't mean that you don't have to increase yield and productivity, but means there is a lot to do along this chain. Now, what are the solutions? And clearly you work on inputs, you work on good practices, on extension services. What we try to do with our project is to have a system to package all these solutions. What are the typical solutions to address these post-harvest losses? And just give you another example, is if you're looking at value added in agriculture per capita, in rich countries, in the industrialized country, an average is about over $15,000. In Africa and the LDCs, this is about $300. So what does it mean? That Africa and other regions, they keep exporting commodities. And unless you add value, the value is never stay here. Because we have to, the formation of capital require increased income. But if you keep exporting commodities, that will not happen. Second point in this process is that quality is an issue. We heard that. Sustainability is an issue, but also quantity. Of course, we have, as an average, I think, of 500 million farms with 2.5 billion people in the world, and most of them, especially in Africa, are just smallholders. Smallholders, we see they have, difficulty in access to know-how, to technology, to implement. They try to do their best with what they have, with their practices, but there's a lot more we can do, and what we try to do, often also with the African Development Bank. What are the solutions? Well, first of all, we heard about innovation. Well, innovation has also elements to be considered. Often when we're working with, in the rural areas with farmers, there is a resistance to innovation. The traditional practices that Chris was referred to, that may be very efficient in the short run, cannot be efficient in the long run. But you need solutions because there is a strong resistance. Very often we see that farmers, they see this is our traditional way, why are you coming with new ideas? So what are the solutions again? The solution is to say, well, we train local people, we have demonstration, we show them that there is a possible to do something different and increase in productivity. It's a cultural issue as well. And I give you an example. This morning we had a lot about tomatoes. We had an interesting experience also in Egypt, for example, where we've been working on the tomato value chain for dried tomatoes. And of course the core issues was good agricultural practices, question of processing storage facilities, but the key problem at the end was identifying the variety. By changing variety with a new one, especially for dry tomatoes, by training local people that would train the farmers in changing slightly the agricultural, the good practice, the practice they were using. And the third, to adding sustainable packaging system, the productivity increased by about 34–38%. So, but that means you need integrated solutions for that. So basically the farmers had an increase in income by applying all these solutions of huge quantity. So that means then they were able to increase the productivity, have a higher income, and export to the other market. Before, they were exporting raw tomato to Europe and importing dry tomato. In Egypt, I mean, you couldn't believe that that is possible. There's a huge, high-quality production that we do. Now we stop that. And now in the local market, we went there, we see that there are local dry tomato. So solutions need an integrated way to look at the environmental, social, and technology as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers and the African Development Bank for the kind invitation. It's an immense pleasure for me to be here on behalf of the International Food Policy Research Institute, participating in this important event. I think Chris has managed to epitomize very well in his keynote speech the key issues that we're discussing here today. And the previous panelists, of course, reflected on a number of issues following that presentation. In my own intervention, I would like to deviate a bit from what has been already mentioned and try to say a few words about the focus of this particular session, as I understand is on building a resilient and sustainable agriculture in Africa. IFPRI in May 2014 organized a major conference in Addis Ababa in connection with its 2020 Vision Initiative on building resilience for food and nutrition security, because we thought it was important for the international development community to delve deeper into this important issue. What are the issues here? First of all, there is a very important conceptual issue. What we mean by resilience is not very clear to many of us, I guess, including myself, what we really mean by resilience. A mainstream, I would say, definition, I would say a working definition might be the capacity at the global, regional, national, community, household, and individual levels to ensure that advanced stressors and shocks do not have long-lasting negative development consequences. However, someone would say, what about vulnerability issues? What about sustainability issues? Do we need to broaden this a bit further? So I think this is an area that someone needs to think a bit further when we talk about building resilience for food and nutrition security. And of course, another issue is the need to cope with a world of shocks, which is becoming a key challenge, and I would say a reality on a daily basis. Shocks which include climate change, conflict and displacement, food prices, spikes, natural disasters and epidemics, and health shocks. Some of these shocks, I have to stress, increase the volatility of food systems at global, regional, national, and even community levels. Others, such as health and income shocks, strike individuals and households, which means that these two types of shocks, systemic vis-à-vis individual ones, require different instruments and different scales. And of course, this leads us to an inevitable conclusion regarding the need to have a resilience lens, I have to say, to look at issues across the food system, which means we need a holistic approach to development interventions. Yet it is important, of course, to bear in mind that people are at the foundation of any system, and building the capacity of a system means building the capacity of the individuals within the system. Going back now to the agricultural productivity issues that Chris raised earlier, I can agree with him more on what he said regarding the technology constraints. So it's really important to invest heavily in agricultural productivity, which remains, of course, a key factor when we talk about African agriculture. A very recent publication from IFPRI, just a few months ago, on a book on agricultural productivity in Africa, highlighted a few important findings. First of all, agricultural productivity in Africa has increased at a moderate rate over time, but there is variation in the rate of growth in land productivity, labor productivity, and total factor productivity, which vary in different parts of Africa. Second, agricultural productivity growth trends vary in different parts of Africa. And this is the result of differences in input use and capital intensities in agricultural production, of course. Furthermore, economic, market, socio-demographic, environmental factors are important determinants of agricultural productivity, as is also, of course, the importance of irrigation that Tim reflected on, investment in new seed varieties, and mechanization. Furthermore, large incremental expenditure and investment in agriculture will be required to raise and maintain a high level of agricultural productivity in Africa. And also investment in agricultural R&D and research and development is very low and needs to be enhanced. We need to reflect further on why this is the case, what the donor community can do to enhance, I would say substantially, research and development in Africa. One of the questions, and I stop here, one of the key questions that I received to reflect on in connection with this particular plenary was on possible success stories, good examples of technologies that have been used in Africa recently or currently being used in order to increase productivity without harming the environment. So I would like to give you 2-3 examples, and then I conclude. One very good example is the urea deep placement technology, which is an innovative fertilizer application technology that plays a very important role of increasing yield and farm income. The use of this particular technology in field trials in Nigeria in 2013 has resulted in increased rice yields by between 18 to 30%, while reducing at the same time fertilizer use by 18% in most locations in Africa, compared with a traditional fertilizer broadcasting method. This is a method that has been developed by IFDC, Its introduction in Africa began only in 2009, relatively recently, I have to say, with very significant positive results so far recorded in Burkina Faso, in Niger, and also in Nigeria. Another good example is the Rice Advice tool developed by the International Rice Research Institute. And this is basically a tool which is an IST-based decision support system which provides guidance on quantity and timing of farmers' most expensive input, fertilizer. Recent evaluations between 2014 and 2015 carried out by Syngenta Foundation in the Senegal River Valley in Senegal, the Lower Volta Basin in Ghana and Mali indicate that the rice advice-based nutrient management increased yields by about 21% in Senegal, 12% in Mali, and 14% in Ghana, compared to farmers' current practices. So this is obviously a very important outcome. And this tool is only ready for use in 2 locations, in Burkina Faso, 3 locations is in Ghana and Senegal. In Nigeria, this particular tool is under a pilot stage in Kogi, Nasarawa, Kano, Ebonyi, Kebbi, and Niger states. So these are some good examples, not necessarily success stories, if you like, but possibly the right route to take when it comes to technologies which are important, are absolutely vital in order to enhance productivity without harming the environment. Thank you so much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we heard from our colleagues. In the interest of time, what I plan to do is I talk less first, and then I ask you to talk less. So which means you can ask very, very pointed, brief, probably half a minute question. But before I give the floor to the question and answer, I've been listening to this wonderful presentations and couldn't wonder to think of my colleagues in the African Development Bank, where we have just recently developed a strategy for the bank. We have a session on that, but I just want the people who led this just to give us a 2 minutes reflection on what has been said. Chiji, he talked this morning, we have heard about him, and Ben is here. I just want to give them the floor. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, and then we go back to the presenters. But just, you don't need to go on, but.
Thank you very much. In June 2016, the Board of Directors approved the Feed Africa Strategy for African Agricultural Transformation from 2016 to 2025. Now, the strategy takes a commodity-based value chain approach, an integrated value chain approach in helping to transform African agriculture. We are looking at 7 enablers that respond to a variety of challenges that underlie the African agricultural landscape. We are looking at about 15 or 18 priority value chains that have been identified across agroecological zones in Africa. We are looking at a resource envelope of about $350 to $400 billion over the next 10 years to help transform African agriculture. Now, of this, the bank intends to quadruple its agricultural investments to about $2.4 billion a year over the next 10 years, making it about $24 billion basically. Now, obviously, the resource gap is very wide. Hence, the Feed Africa strategy is not just a bank-only strategy. In fact, it's a platform for all stakeholders seated here and those not here to join the bank and push African agriculture beyond the levels it has ever reached before. So in a nutshell, this is where we are with African agriculture. We would be delivering a more detailed presentation tomorrow on this. Thanks.
Thank you, really, Ben. So you can leave the mic over there. So colleagues, okay, Francis, and I see one hand. John? gentleman here and then gentleman over there. So, but as I said, half a minute, please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, good presenters. I'm Ben Agboka, a professor of economics, and currently the president of Nigerian Economic Society. So I'm not an agriculturalist or agricultural economist. So in that sense, I may only say I'm looking through the window. So looking through the window, I would say water is key to agricultural sustainability. And that's why I find the concept introduced by Timothy Williams interesting, economic water scarcity. Why this may not be applicable to a number of African countries, I think at the country context level, it matters. Take the case of Nigeria. There was a time, and even up to now, we say we have that kind of common expression that water everywhere, but none to drink. That's for drinking water. But when it comes to agric, I think it's the other way around now. We had irrigation-led or driven agriculture in the north because it was arid that time. The bulk of the south didn't have irrigation. And as I was coming, even this morning, we drove over River Niger. We drove over a number of streams across the river. And I was telling my wife, who was in the car with me, I said, look at this, all this water that defined the structure of Nigeria is dried up. Which means in 10, 20 years' time, there won't be water to drive irrigation there. And in the north, there are big dams that were irrigated. We don't have that in the south now. So right from Lokoja down, even before Lokoja down to the south, we'll have this problem. So there's economic water scarcity problem. How do we do the irrigation-led agric in that context? Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. You can give the mic to those in the back. Yes, please, let's limit the question because we have 2 more days, 2 more plenaries, 3 more, yeah, and so many parallel sessions. So let's use good time of...
Francis Mulango, African Center for Economic Transformation, Accra. Well, we know the Green Revolution was a result of application of a number of packages. Improved seed, fertilization, irrigation, and so on and so forth. Through some of the examples that also George mentioned, we know that there are pockets of evidence scattered throughout the continent where, various sort of application of these bundles, as Chris mentioned, has yielded good results. But the question is, I think for me, how do you scale it up? I mean, because we know what works, and we know where it works. How do you, come out from sort of this closed, airtight, experimental environment and, scale it up to the national, the regional level? That's, I think, a question that I want to put to the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. You can give it to, half a minute, please. Less than that, if you can.
Yeah. My name is Ofan Odofia, Institute of Export Operations and Management. Chris mentioned when he was doing the presentation about market access. And while we were in the bigger hall, the minister talked about African trading among ourselves. There's a huge gap. And with the Feed Africa project of the African Development Bank, how do the private sector comes in? If we have some concept, if you have where we can also work together, because you've said that you cannot do it alone, is there a platform that the private sector can bring in their suggestion or their programs and you look into it? Thank you.
Excellent. So what I do is I come back to our distinguished panelists to reflect 1 minute each on some of the questions or the things they haven't said. And then we wrap up because the parallel sessions have to start exactly at 16 hours. We are about 5 minutes away. We apologize. Normally it should start at 3, I think, 3:30, but we are half an hour late. And listening to the young and the researchers is also one of the objectives of the AEC. So without much, I will just pass on to Chris and all the way down, each 1 minute.
So let me make 4 very quick points. First, innovations that seem to work. The one example on water I left water out a bit because I knew Tim was going to cover it. But solar-powered drip irrigation is increasingly viable, especially in the drier, semi-arid and arid lands of Africa, where there is physical water availability, but not economically viable water availability under old solar technologies. That's changing quickly. We economists need to get out and doing some good impact evaluation of that work, but that's a viable area for real intervention. A second area of innovation, and this speaks to the last comment around financing, there's a gap in financing between microfinance, which is really intended for very small-scale, household-based, single-person self-employment enterprises. It's not for businesses. And large-scale commercial finance that's available to very large-scale firms. The commercial financing of small and medium-sized enterprises remains a real challenge in Africa. The interbank lending market is underdeveloped. There needs to be real attention paid to corporate finance in Africa, targeted in particular, I would argue, at the food supply system, at the post-harvest processing, manufacturing, distribution, including restaurant chains, et cetera. That's a commercial financing challenge. It's also an insurance challenge for primary producers. Excellent work done by the Kenyan economist Andrew Mude, developing index-based livestock insurance in the Horn of Africa and Kenya and Ethiopia, which won the Borlaug Prize this past year for the top agricultural research by a scientist under 40. The evidence on index-based livestock insurance is that the marginal benefit cost ratio is 12 times that of conditional cash transfers. 12 times. It's a fixed cost operation delivered entirely by the private sector at the margin. Once you get the design work done, the private sector will take over and distribute the product, and it's already demonstrated to have real benefits in drought. So we're getting innovations in simple commercial products as well as in things like solar technology. The last point I want to make, an excellent point raised about post-harvest loss. And for young researchers in the audience, I think this is an area of real potential for future research, because we all know that losses are big. What we don't know is what are optimal loss rates. They're not zero. It costs money to prevent loss. And moreover, we have to guard against preserving in the food supply chain unsafe food. And there's a direct trade-off between food safety and the conservation of food, the protection against losses. We don't know what optimal post-harvest loss rates look like, and we don't know the right trade-offs there. That's an area ripe for exploration for those of you researchers interested at the interface between business, agriculture, and human health. Thank you.
Let me quickly touch on what the president of Nigerian Economic Association mentioned. That is a real challenge facing Africa going forward. You mentioned rivers drying up, and yet we need to expand availability of irrigation. The good thing is what you see drying up is what we call surface water. There is also groundwater, but it's much more expensive to tap into groundwater. But by managing conjunctive use of both surface water and groundwater, we can actually improve the irrigation in Africa. But it requires investment to be able to come up with the necessary equipment, as well as the tools that will be needed to be able to scientifically and with precision tap groundwater where groundwater is. But the other aspect which we need to take into consideration is that climate change is going to affect water availability, whether in terms of precipitation, whether in terms of river flow, or whether in terms of groundwater recharge. And that means we need to mainstream agricultural water management into climate change adaptation policies. So talking about climate resilient agriculture, the importance is to look at the bridges across sectors. The agricultural sector, the energy sector, the financial sector, and bring them all together to play and have a role in the plan to be able to irrigate Africa. So the point then is we cannot look at irrigation on its own. And we cannot look at developing agriculture without looking at irrigation, without looking at energy, without looking at transport and the environment as well. Because if we don't manage the adaptation to climate, then we run into a risk whereby even the very little water available will not be sufficient to allow us to achieve the aim and objectives that we have in mind.
Thank you. I think Chris made my point, so I'll try to make another one at the moment. No, I definitely agree on the need to look into the post-harvest losses. From some analysis that I had, of course, they happen in different stages of the supply, the value chain. Of course, I took this figure that the harvest is about 2 to 5%, sorting 1-2%, processing 1 to 5, packaging 3 to 6, transport around 5%, and storage. Also, we had this morning in the problem also in relation to food safety. If you don't store properly, then you create aflatoxin, so the product is not available. So further research, further work on that is required. And of course, when you introduce technology, it has to be sustainable technology. That's also what, as UNIDO, we try to promote. So link it to that. The second point, I think the other question is the private sector. Private sector is not the enemy. The private sector is a partner in the process. Cannot expect nowadays that the government will take over and invest all the billions required to make agriculture sustainable, make food available. The question is, how do you manage the process? There is a huge change in the way private sector deals with development and business, how development objectives and business objectives can be put together. So how you manage that process is the way. We have some experience also in Eastern and Southern Africa with the supermarket chains. I mean, I remember 20 years ago, they were considered the enemy of agricultural production. They say, oh, they're coming, they destroy our business. Well, it has been proven that this was not the case. Why? Because they need to source, according to their business model, locally. So with Shoprite or Pick and Pay, they have to source locally, because if they have to import it, this will be out of business. This stimulates a lot of new opportunity. So again, private sector can drive that development. The third point that I like to make is, of course, the connection between large, medium scale, and smallholder farmers. This process of integration, the process of clustering them or making consortia, and how to compare, because again, an example, in Ethiopia we have edible oil, large companies, and you have a lot of hundreds of small producers. Out of the market, low quality, low productivity. You have to work with them and you connect. There are different systems, there are different methods, but that's the way. You cannot see, you know, high profitable business, private company, large corporation, and small guys. You have to link to them and to reduce the gap in the supply chain. These are types of solutions that I think would make agriculture more sustainable and resilience in Africa. That means people want to stay, want to work in the farm if they're given an opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the previous panelists captured many of the issues raised, including some issues raised in the questions earlier. Just 2 points from my side in the interest of time. One is about the key challenge that the international community is facing right now, namely the need to feed 2.4 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa by the middle of the current century. 2.4 billion people. This is a challenge. We don't have to discuss now details on what it takes, how we can do that. I'm sure over the next couple of days we can reflect on that, but this is a huge challenge, which takes me to the second point. At least to me, what is really important is the need for a grand design when we talk about agricultural transformation, because certainly I guess everyone agrees in this room that agricultural reform and transformation cannot wait any further. The international community needs to act quickly and it needs to act now. So I'm very pleased to see all these important initiatives emanating from the international development community the last, I would say, few years and months, including, of course, the very impressive agenda of President Adesina, with whom I had the pleasure and the honor of working closely together while he was the Minister of Agriculture here in Nigeria a couple of years ago. So I think this is very important direction to take. And let me give you an example. What happened with the Millennium Development Goals a few years back? I guess in an ex-post assessment, many of us would agree, if not all of us, that certainly we could do better with the Millennium Development Goals. The reasons we partially failed with the Millennium Development Goals, I have to say, is because we ignore the interlinkages among the goals. And this is exactly what I mean by grand design. You cannot transform agriculture without substantial improvements in energy, in infrastructure, investment in human capital, in education, the industrialization process, and the overall integration process. And that's why I believe that the five fives of the African Development Bank is moving to the right direction, because it takes into account this particular need for a grand design when we talk about agricultural transformation in Africa. Thank you.
Okay, John, you may turn off the mic, and I think we have reached to the end of this plenary session. Before we leave, if you don't mind, give me 1 minute because I haven't said much. So this 1 minute, I want to use it to what was supposed to be a lunchtime presentation between me and Chris about advertising something very interesting to the community here. I don't know how many of you know, but we have what we call structural transformation in African agriculture and rural spaces, and the name is called STARS. It's coined by Chris way back 2 years ago. We sat together in a small hotel room and discussed about the future of building a network of institutions, but also that extends to researchers in agriculture. And we felt there is a huge gap, and as a result we put together institutions, the African Development Bank, the African Economic Research Consortium, Poverty and Economic Policy, PEP, both based in Nairobi, the World Bank and Cornell organized a small conference. From our side, the research department and our agricultural department colleagues here collaborated, and the outcome was, I think, excellent. Almost a small AEC, you can call it. Now the second phase is coming up, and we would like to invite all of you, researchers, to visit the STARS website. If you hit STARS, you will be led to a website. We will be providing visiting fellowship to Cornell University for promising researchers in the area. And your papers will be published in hopefully lead development journals. The ones that had taken place in Addis Ababa in December are being now processed in World Development and Agricultural Economics. But most of all, also our interest is to step up the game and hopefully engage the policy community and the decision-making bodies. And we are extending also invitations to join this group. Hopefully, IFPRI will join at some point. Who knows, IFAD, because we have seen some interest. And then my own partners who are sitting here in the table, UNECA and UNDP. But generally, I just want to let you know that the agriculture issue will not be limited to the African Economic Conference. It has a very strong home in what we call STARS, and thank you for your hearing. We go to the breakout sessions. There are 5 of them, and please, especially older people like me, go and support the young people who are presenting their papers. I wish you a good afternoon. And then at 6 o'clock, there is a presentation of an excellent report by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. We have to support them. Since we are here, every event, please try to attend. I know Abuja is attractive. There is an urge to go out and see the place, but please at least keep that for another day.